AMD's Radeon series got off to quite a rocky launch, and with the second generation launching into a GPU shortage where whatever you would make could sell, has this led to now AMD having made one of the best GPUs available on the used market, or one that you're better off avoiding? Now I'm borrowing this Radeon 6700 XT off a friend of mine because he sent me over a message saying that these things were on sale for a great price over on Amazon. I think they were selling for around £220 to £230 brand new on Amazon across the Prime Day sales. So it got me wondering, was this actually a good deal? Because this is around a quarter of what this thing cost him brand new? So is this actually a graphics card worth buying? Because I've never actually looked at Navi, I've never looked at any RDNA graphics cards other than the iGPUs, and even then, it's quite fortunate that I'm sent mini PCs, or at least one mini PC that I was able to look at it in. So given that I've never looked at AMD's Navi, and these things are now available at what seems to be an amazing price, just what is the Radeon 6700 XT, and how powerful actually is it? So in my mind this seems like a very recent graphics card, but in fact the 6700 XT launched 4 years ago now during the GPU crisis, when you literally couldn't buy any graphics card, and I think you could, even on the used market, an R9 290 was going to cost you about 150 quid back then, so there really weren't many options. Until AMD announced the Radeon 6700 XT, which was meant to be a mid-range card, and it had decent enough specifications to back up what it was asking. It was based on the RDNA 2 architecture, which brought some much needed improvements over the original, and is based on the Navi 22 XT variant. It's got 12GB of GDDR6, so still more than enough for 2025, and this is all functioning on a 192-bit memory bus, which does sound a little bit small, but I didn't actually run into all too many problems with it. Still, compared to some cards on the market, it's nice to actually see something that's over 128-bit, but it's alright. In terms of drivers, they are all up to date and supported, and I ran into no problems with them. There's more on that later, and it has 2560 cores, 160 TMUs, and 64 ROPs, which is quite in line with their previous mid-range, which was the RX 480. I know there was a line in between that, but given the RX 480 was the card that we class as successful from AMD, it makes sense that what was a good mid-range there could be a good mid-range here. It supports DirectX 12 Ultimate, all the latest versions of Vulkan, and uses power consumption of 212 watts, which is because it's massively overvolted, but we do some things to change that around in just a moment. You can pick them up today for around £170 or dollars or euros. They all seem to be in that sort of range, and they top out around the same in pounds, dollars and euros at 250. So they're in that sort of ballpark for what is a mid-range graphics card price. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably avoided anything to do with computers for that entire period of the pandemic. I mean, I spent about a year, 2 years of it constantly uploading, sometimes twice a week, and I just completely burnt myself out because there was nothing really interesting happening. So I missed the launch of Navi, and I wasn't too interested in catching up with it because I simply couldn't afford it. But it turns out that this was part of AMD's RDNA 2 lineup, so it went on to power the PlayStation 5 and then the Xbox Series X and S. And it was meant to be a mid-range graphics card designed for 1440p gaming and some light 4K gaming, so think of it very much like a replacement to the RX 480, a card that we all know and love and is still hanging in there very well in 2025. It was meant to launch around, sort of the $450 to $500 region, but good luck finding one when they launched at that price. Most of these were selling for upwards of £800 over here, which I believe is what it cost my mate Mr. Daniel, who is the one that lent us this graphics card. Reviews at the time were fairly decent. I mean, they weren't exactly positive because it came out in an era where you could release any card and it would sell. So it was competitive in most games that were AMD optimized. It had access to smart access memory, which did give some performance gains back in the day. I believe it gave some more now, and it was slightly cheaper than its main Nvidia competitor, the RTX 3070. But the reason why it was slightly more panned on launch than some of the Nvidia releases was, even though it was actually meant to be cheaper, it wasn't, and you ended up with rather questionable driver support. Apparently some of the reference models were actually a little bit too loud and too noisy, and in terms of DirectX 11 titles, in classic AMD fashion, it just underperformed compared to Nvidia's options, and most of the popular games back then were still using DirectX 11. But now in 2025, a lot has changed. I've been trying to get up to date, I've watched a few video reviews, I've read a few reviews, and all of the comments sections are saying people want to see this card revisited because it was so badly panned for being just slightly worse than the 3070 on launch and worse than some of the used options on the market and sold for the same price because of the shortage, that how is it doing today when you can pick these up very easily? The world has shifted towards DirectX 12 and Vulkan. How are they holding up today? So reviews and at least people's opinion on the card has changed, and to be fair, I've used this card and I'm quite enjoying it, and you're probably going to find out why quite soon. In terms of the actual drivers and the issues that people have had with them, they seem to be all gone. It always seems to be an issue when AMD launches a new architecture. They abandon their previous architecture. Fortunately, GCN has modded drivers and was so compute-based that it was actually able to carry on with just games utilizing DirectX 12 and actually direct access to the card itself, that it wasn't too much of a problem, but it meant that you ended up with the worst of both worlds. AMD's GCN was abandoned and Navi drivers were of a questionable quality, but that all seems to be resolved now, and I can confirm I've had no issues with drivers whatsoever. Call the later drivers working ones or call it AMD fine wine, whatever you really want to, the drivers on these cards are more or less perfect now. And I did have some comments telling me a while ago when I was criticizing AMD for overvolting their cards that these have the same problem, and I can confirm these cards are still incredibly overvolted, which is something they've been doing for about 10-12 years now, just pumping so much voltage into their cards they just don't need. And either my mate got a golden sample or these things just undervolt incredibly well, because we saw a sizable increase in performance, we saw a massive drop in average power consumption, and thermals were on average 10 degrees lower. So if you're buying one of these AMD cards, you definitely need to undervolt them. Either way, there is a button you can click in the AMD drivers and it does automatically undervolt your card, but for the best performance, just throw up a benchmark in the background, have at it with the voltages until it crashes, work up from there, and you should get something that's not only going to be stable, but it will use less power and just work better. So if you're getting one of these cards, be sure to undervolt them because the drivers work fine. The only issue I've had with it was it's just simply running too much voltage at its stock settings. Now we're running things today with a Ryzen 7 3700X using the latest drivers for the AMD Radeon 6700 XT as of July 2025. And I've gone through, and given that I don't have this graphics card for very long, I've done as many benchmarks as possible, including some of the latest and greatest titles, the most popular titles out there on Steam, and some of the fan favourites that we see on this channel that we love seeing benchmarked. So all that really remains to be seen is, for the money that's out there on the market, how does the Radeon 6700 XT perform in the benchmarks? Starting off the benchmarks, we have a game that usually cripples most cards we test on the channel with Oblivion Remastered, and we did run the game with medium settings and ray tracing set to the lower options, which ran pretty decent to be fair. We were running the game in 1440p and we saw around 37 FPS on average. Now this is quite a cruel game to start things with, as I found Oblivion Remastered to be a bit of a confusing one in terms of performance. It doesn't seem to scale as well as you want it to, and some settings have more effects than others. Either way, we got the game looking and running rather well, and in towns and cities this is about what you'd see. In terms of actually going into caves and dungeons, you'd see upwards of 50 to 60 FPS. When you're actually outside in the open though, well, the frame rate could tank, and to make it more stable you would be better off enabling FSR. Now you didn't have to do this and the frame rate would eventually stabilize to around a similar frame rate it was before, but if you want consistency you're better off enabling FSR. Generally though, you'd be seeing around 37 FPS without it, and around 40 to 45 with it turned on. Either way, it's your preference, and Oblivion Remastered really impressed me here with how decently it was running. Kicking us off with a new one here with Doom the Dark Ages, and the reason this benchmark's taken me so long is because these games are around 60 to 100 gigs in size, and with my internet they take a while to download. Either way, with the game running in medium settings in 1440p, we saw around 40 FPS on average, and I am playing with a FreeSync monitor, so this looked perfectly fine to me. If you drop things down to 1080p, you could see 60 FPS on average, or if you use some other upscaling technology you could as well. But just to give you an idea of a baseline of how this card's performing in 1440p, you are still going to see excellent visuals in a decent resolution. If you want to enable path tracing, which I believe is the version that's used here, you are going to have to drop the resolution down to 720p and enable FSR on the balanced presets. You will still see the game run between 40 to 60 FPS a lot of the time with these settings, but it is really intensive and goes to show that the ray tracing side of this card is still its weakness, especially in these latest and greatest titles. I'm sure with some more tweaking around and once a more comfortable benchmark in this game we can figure out what works best, but as it stands, medium settings in 1440p seems to be your best bet for playing Doom the Dark Ages. Another time that we've actually seen a game completely playable on a card with Stalker 2, running with medium and high settings in 1440p and absolutely no form of upscaling. Now the main thing about this game that seems sporadic is its VRAM usage, as it'll go from using 5GB up to 8GB almost seemingly at random, and then drop straight back down again, which is why performance on lower end cards seems so sporadic, and actually here with 12GB of VRAM we saw no problems whatsoever. We didn't need any upscaling technology, this was a native 1440p with some options even turned on high, and it is a very good looking game. Either way, we saw 45 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 33 FPS, so Stalker 2 was more than playable on the 6700 XT. And finally, another game I've been able to launch and benchmark with Forza Motorsport, which we are running with high settings and high enabled on ray tracing in 1440p. And this is an example of how this card deals with ray tracing when it is in a heavily optimized setting. Now it probably helps that this is a port of the Xbox version, so it means that it is running on the Xbox with the same sort of hardware, especially the underlying RDNA 2 part, but it goes to show that ray tracing can be incredibly well optimized, as it looked fantastic in this game with those perfect reflections and those perfect lighting decals. It was a great experience that looked wonderful with 67 FPS on average in 1440p, so Forza Motorsport wasn't a problem. So I was going to drop City Skylines 2 from the benchmark suite, but it turns out people absolutely love seeing this benchmarked, so we are going to test it here with medium settings in 1440p. And it does turn out that performance in City Skylines 2, as much as people want to see it, is not exactly spectacular. I mean, it still looks very nice. I was building up this little town and city, but the performance just seems to be all over the place. I remember this game coming out and someone was saying that even the NPCs have individually modelled teeth. And all of this for a game that, frankly, is worse looking than SimCity from 2013. Maybe that's just my personal opinion, but it's lacking in the stylization. Some of the angles look absolutely gorgeous in this game, but the performance that it's asking for it, a little bit too much. Either way, it does run perfectly fine here. This is one that's always in the comments saying, can I add Palworld to my benchmarks? And I'm not really up to date with how to play this game, but I tried to play through what I'm assuming is the intro tutorial, and we saw the game running at a locked 60 FPS most of the time with high and ultra settings in 1440p. And if people are wondering, why is this game capped at 60 FPS? Well, although it is an Unreal 5 title, and one that seems to actually be relatively well optimized for an Unreal Engine 5 title, it is still a little bit questionable in places, especially when you uncap the frame rate, as you could look at it 60 and see it be perfectly smooth, or if you uncapped it, it just went crazy. You would be hitching and stuttering all over the place, and the card wasn't seeing real utilization, so you are better off capping the frame rate and playing it like this if your Palworld is a game you're trying to get into. Now, for one of the most intensive ray tracing titles out there, we have Half-Life 2 RTX, and I don't care what people say, when this game looks and runs well, it looks fantastic, but you need to have the system set up for it to run that well. And unfortunately, this really does show the downsides of AMD's ray tracing here, as when it is just true path tracing being required, without any of the NVIDIA enhancements, which I mean, this is an NVIDIA title, so it makes sense, you had to drop things to 480p with the lower settings to see 30 FPS. Now don't be wrong, it didn't run much better than this on my 2080 Super, which is a used card that this is very comparable to, so it's not too bad, but does go to show that out and out path tracing is going to be a struggle as things get more intensive in the future. To throw a little bit more optimism into the mix though, I did run GTA 5 Enhanced Edition with Ultra settings and Ultra Enable on Ray Tracing. Now this didn't include the second bounce option, but it did have all the other options set to Ultra, so it was nice to see that in 1440p we were able to see 58 FPS on average, and the worst frame rate we ever saw throughout the entire time benchmarking was still 48 FPS, and it was very rare you'd ever see this figure. So GTA 5 Enhanced Edition goes to show that games can still be very well optimized and include what is rather nice lighting effects utilizing ray tracing, and still see remarkably good settings even on a 6700 XT. But things are not always so jolly. Over in the world of DirectX 11 and the more popular version of GTA Online with Legacy, we know that it has issues on graphics cards with utilization. And here we did see the game run alright with 66 FPS on average, utilizing Ultra settings and AMD's CHS shadows, which I still think actually hold up remarkably well. Now, the game wasn't perfect, as there were a few hitches and stutters in places when you first launched, and this was in a large lobby. Now, we all know large lobbies in GTA Online Legacy do have utilization problems on the processor and the graphics card. Pair that with the fact this card doesn't have the best DirectX 11 support in the world, and you end up with a game that should be seeing a higher frame rate, but this is a worst case scenario. It's utilizing DirectX 11 on a very botched version of the online, which is dealing with over 16 players, and is utilizing Ultra settings as well. It's still more than playable, but the frame times just weren't paced as nicely as they were in the Enhanced Edition. However, this isn't going to say there's tons of problems in DirectX 11, as actually BeamNG seemed to work absolutely fine here, utilising the jungle map, which has got plenty of draw calls and brings most cards I test down to a crawl. In fact, the last card we tested that was able to handle these settings was the R9 Fury, so it's nice to actually use a graphics card that can test this and run it perfectly fine with well over 60 FPS and plenty of headroom left over. So we saw BeamNG running with Ultra settings and looking absolutely fantastic, with no problems, and this was utilizing DirectX 11. Really, I should have gone through and tested it as well with Vulkan, but maybe we can do that again in the future. Baldur's Gate 3 is a prime example. It did not run spectacularly in DirectX 11 mode, but when you swap things over to Vulkan, suddenly you see why the focus on these cards really has been brought out with the future, because the performance increase was just absolutely brilliant. We could run the game with high and ultra settings in 1440p, this was after waiting quite a while for the shaders to compile, and we were seeing the game run at 85 FPS on average. Now eventually I will have to get a save that is later on in the game so we can start benchmarking these newer cards in a more intensive segment. I just haven't had the time to play through Baldur's Gate 3, mostly because there's a new RimWorld DLC out, but still, the point remains, it runs Baldur's Gate 3 fine, and I'm sure it'll handle you through to the late game with no problems. When it comes to Counter-Strike 2, I'm fairly sure in some ways we were being CPU limited, as we saw 280 FPS on average, and 1% lows that really weren't far beneath this. This was using competitive settings, so mostly low with high shadows. Once again, people have told me that there are better options out there now, but to keep some degree of, sort of comparison, similarity with our other previous benchmarks, I did test it with these settings. Realistically, in-game you can use high options, and you will still see a similar frame rate, so this card has got plenty left over to play Counter-Strike with higher settings. Either way, very competitive. I've used it for a few games of Counter-Strike, and there's no problems whether you're testing the intensive benchmark or actually playing a competitive match. Mount & Blade Bannerlord, once again, we know it to be one of the most optimized titles of recent years, and here it goes to show that it really does run fine. Now, ultra settings here look absolutely fantastic, especially in the larger scale battles when you have got plenty going on. And I didn't realize how much VRAM this game really wants, because I think we're using 6 to 7 gigabytes in places for the game running at ultra settings in 1440p. Either way, throughout the benchmark we saw over 140 FPS most of the time, so for those of you with a high refresh monitor, it is the perfect type of graphics card to get into playing these types of games with the highest settings at high frame rates. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds was a little bit of a weird one here, because you're probably seeing that average and thinking 60 FPS, what's that about? And I couldn't tell you. I tried the DirectX 11 renderer, I tried DirectX 11.1, I eventually settled on DirectX 12 because nothing seemed to fix what appeared to be almost a locked VSync here. Now, I couldn't change it, there was no options I could do. I tried resetting the configs, I tried verifying the game, I tried copying a different set of files over. Nothing seemed to make PUBG want to work at over 60 FPS on this graphics card. Maybe it's the latest drivers, I was using the latest release, not the most stable release, so it could be things like that, but either way, PUBG works fine, just it should be running at a higher frame rate than this. Probably one of my favourite games of recent years with Cyberpunk 2077, and running the game with high settings in 1440p, we saw the game run at 63 FPS on average, with really good frame times. We're talking frame times that hardly moved about, and this didn't matter whether you're in the benchmark or actually playing in-game itself. It looked and it ran excellent. You could have even turned a few things up to Ultra, and you still would have got away with a very similar frame rate. It's only when you started turning on things like path tracing that you'd see the game require you to drop to 720p, and even then it wouldn't be playable, running at around 21 FPS on average with excellent frame times, keep in mind, but your lowest would going to be 18 FPS. Now, you can run the game with ray tracing, but to get the best experience here you still had to drop the game down to 720p, and you're probably seeing that 51 FPS average and thinking surely we can go higher than that. Well, you can, but the problem is when you actually went in-game, which can be a lot more demanding than the actual benchmark can be, the frame rate would be all over the place, so 720p with ray tracing was the best you were going to be able to do. It's lucky that Red Dead Redemption 2 caught my eye because it is a good game to benchmark, it's just one that takes a long time to benchmark and get everything set up. So to make things easier on myself, I loaded up the game, ran it with DirectX 12, and we just whacked everything up to Ultra. Because I thought, you know, this is a new graphics card in what is a very well optimized game, surely we can see some great gameplay here. And it turns out, yes, Ultra settings in 1440p is really not a problem for Red Dead Redemption 2. Once again, this is the same type of hardware you're finding in the latest and greatest Microsoft and Sony consoles. So games that will be targeting high settings on those should be able to run with high and ultra settings here. So Red Dead Redemption 2 wasn't a problem and you can get away playing it absolutely fine. The thing is though, and I don't think anyone's bothered to test this yet, can it run Crysis? Well, given this is a game that we have issues with on the latest Nvidia cards, the latest Intel cards, how does it fare on some of the newer AMD cards? Well, it's not perfect, because when I first launched the game, up until I reloaded my save, the game was full of hitches and stutters. It turns out that once you die or reload your save, the game seems to run absolutely fine. I don't know why it runs like this, it's probably just a bug in the drivers, because who is really supporting Crysis from 2008? Either way, it looks and runs excellent. I mean, it really is up there in terms of visual fidelity with a lot of the latest and greatest games we've tested. Maybe it's art direction, maybe it's how overbuilt the game was, but it's nice to see that AMD's graphics cards can still handle Crysis at ultra settings, which means, and for the reason we test this game, it means that you can run all your old DirectX 10, DirectX 9, DirectX 8 games absolutely fine with ultra settings, because usually if they work with Crysis, they will work with every other game from before it. So how is the performance overall for the 6700 XT? Well, to be fair, I actually found it really rather decent. Now, keep in mind, I did try to do as much tweaking as possible, which was a little bit harder on some of the newer games that I've not really benchmarked too much, to give you the most ideal performance there can be. So it seems to be the main limit of the 6700 XT isn't the raster performance at all, it works absolutely fine. And with 12GB of VRAM, it certainly has more than enough for a good few years to come, because we only saw it top out around 7 to 9GB, and those were brief spikes during certain games, mostly Unreal Engine 5 games, where they seem to just spike up in VRAM usage for seemingly no reason. So performance was really rather decent, especially in 1440p, which is something that I wanted to test most games in. It wasn't really worth moving up to 4K because it does still have a tiny 192-bit memory bus, which can be really rather limiting, especially for a mid-range card, when even AMD used to push 4K for this sort of tier of cards. Either way, some of the standouts for me were Oblivion Remastered, which is the first time we've seen it run absolutely fine. Forza Motorsport was fantastic to see, which turns out is a beautifully optimized title. You just have to be able to own a graphics card that can launch it, because it goes to show sometimes ray tracing on this card works absolutely fine. It just seems to be that every single benchmark we've done, the only limits ever come from the fact that the ray tracing hardware, when it's not optimized for AMD's side, which fair enough, most cards are Nvidia side cards, means that performance just drops off a cliff when you go to use it. But if you tweak around a little bit and do mix and match your ray tracing settings, you can have it run. So it seems like across the board, if you want a graphics card that just runs everything and runs it well in 1080p or 1440p with high settings, this seems to be a very well performing card. People are always asking me to test emulation, and if you do want a graphics card that seems to handle emulation without any problems whatsoever, this could be the graphics card for you. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are probably other RDNA 2 cards that do seem to handle it as well as this one will, for a lower price point. It just depends on what resolution settings you want to target. So for your Wii, your Wii U, your Xbox 360, anything from that generation, it seemingly works absolutely fine thanks to excellent Vulkan and DirectX 12 support. One of the main limits for older emulation back in the day always used to be OpenGL, which is something that AMD cards always fared somewhat okay with, but never did as well as they should have. So it seems to be now most things are moving towards DirectX 12 and APIs like that. You are seeing excellent performance. I mean, the footage on screen is shown from an old Wii game running in 8K with enhancements. So you can run some of those older titles up to 8K with enhancements, and the graphics card really isn't breaking a sweat. So for emulation, these cards are more than fine, and I'd say the RDNA 2 line is probably great for emulation based off the performance of this card here. Having done a bit of basic testing with the AMD VCE engine, I do believe it received some slight enhancements for this generation, but it's nothing really to boast home about in an era where you could just go out and buy an Intel card if you're doing any media work. Once again, I do a lot of media work, and I have nothing but praise to say for the Intel cards, so if you want something for media work, this will do okay, just there are better options on the market. It has great compute performance, and it does actually support HEVC and things like that, so when I test it across OBS, Handbrake and even the built-in drivers, yes, you can do some AMD VCE recording, and it performs well enough at low bitrate, which seems to be a bit of a return to form for AMD, as that was one of their selling points back in the day, is you could get away with streaming using the VCE engine, and you can still do that today. So yes, you have AMD VCE, yes it does work. Would I say to go and buy it just for that? Maybe not. I suppose on one hand it is the cheapest way to get into HDMI 2.1. At least it used to be the cheapest way to get into HDMI 2.1, which some people left a few comments about during the post I put up a few days before this, so maybe that is an aspect to take into consideration, but for most people, this really isn't a media workstation card. It is a good gaming card, but there are better workstation cards out there. So there we have it, the Radeon 6700 XT. And it really has taken me a little while to get my thoughts together and just how I feel about the performance of the card, because during the benchmarks I had endless praise, but towards the end of the videos when I have to factor all of this in, we do have to consider what the performance is like for the money you're spending. Now don't be wrong, the main competition for this on the used market I'd say is the 2080 Super. because that's what I've actually given to my mate to use in the meantime, and that was sold for a very similar price to what you can buy one of these for. Now, they seem to be trading blows on the used market, with this one actually offering higher rasterization performance, but worse performance in terms of ray tracing. Now, there's not a huge deal of ray tracing performance difference between them, not as much as they used to be, as the GeForce 2000 series has fallen out of favour a little bit with ray tracing, but it does still perform better on the RTX cards. The main thing is though, and this is a huge point to consider, is AMD has FSR, and it just does not look anywhere near as good as the new Transformer model DLSS from Nvidia, which is a huge advantage on the cheap RTX cards because it does eke out surprisingly better visuals with much better upscaling. I try to avoid upscaling where I can, especially on AMD cards, and I know things will improve with FSR 4 and things like that being adopted, but most old games out there aren't offering you the new upscalers. You're being offered FSR 2 or FSR 3, which pales in comparison to the quality you get from Transformer model DLSS. But that's besides the point. But in the future, when we're going to be relying on upscaling to extend the life of these cards, unless there's going to be a way to brute force FSR 4 or the newer versions in drivers, a bit like how Nvidia lets you do it, at least I'm fairly sure they let you do it, there is just a huge glaring aspect to this card that means it's great for now, but the FSR quality massively needs to improve to see some long-term longevity out of it. Either way, for now though, the right here, right now, I've seen models of this card sell for as low as £150, and for the price, I reckon this could be the best performing card there is out there on the market. I mean, yes, when it comes to path tracing, you are looking at 720p with awful frame rates, but for just ray tracing, and specifically just normal actual gameplay rasterization, this card is fantastic. But there are other options on the market. Mostly, when this card can't really do ray tracing that well unless it's a specifically optimized title like Forza, there are other options out there. I mean, AMD's Vega, at least on paper, seems to be very comparable to this card. So maybe I'll have to get one of those, because those are going for about £50 to £80, which is under half the price. And if it's only having to do rasterization, maybe it'll be comparable. Either way, that is a massive tangent of a conclusion. I hope you've all enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to Mr. Daniel for lending me this graphics card, and good night.